So I found this article to be a fascinating read. I know that a couple of other content creators have sort of dove into this a little bit over the past week. I've been sort of reserving my thoughts for a little bit because I wanted to talk about this sort of from my perspective as someone who has been working in game development for about a decade now. I'll be, on an indie scale, but still with a little bit of insight into some of these things and sort of the unrealistic expectations that a lot of gamers have about production and expenses and what really goes into making games. So it's a very interesting discussion around how there are some indie game developers who have stood up in the face of Baldur's Gate 3 being called like this once in a generation game that is sort of going to define RPGs for the next 20 years. And you've got these small time indie devs sitting up straight and going, well, hang on, actually, guys, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this. You need to understand the difference between a 30 to 40 man team and a 400 man team that's making a massive game of this scope. Baldur's Gate 3 is the game that has taken Larian Studios from being a very well established independent game company that earned their reputation on the way up with successful releases of Divinity, Original Sin 2, then the limited definitive edition of those games. Like they proved their worth on the way up. And unless I'm mistaken, I vaguely recall Sven at one point talking about how they originally pitched Wizards of the Coast on a D&D game years ago and were turned down because they didn't have enough experience. But then after they did the two Kickstarters and proved that they were able to, make something of that caliber, only then were they able to win the contract to be able to pursue a Dungeons and Dragons game, and more importantly, the successor to the Baldur's Gate franchise. For them to have gone from a 120 man team to a 400 man team, people need to understand the magnitude of what that means and the amount of money that goes into that. And this is where I don't know that it's ever been addressed, but Larian Studios went from being a studio to having multiple studios to having hundreds of people around the world working on this project. And I don't know that they did that all by themselves because with Wizards of the Coast behind them, I don't know how much backing they got from Wizards of the Coast to put into this project because WotC needs this to be a hugely successful game to continue to push Dungeons and Dragons into the modern era. So I would imagine that there is a lot of money on their end in the table as well. I don't know if this is just something that's licensed by Larian Studios or not. And I would love if somebody out there has better information on that, I would love to dive into that more because that's something that I actually never poked my nose around in. So if I'm speaking out of error, I would love somebody in the comments to just correct me on that because I don't know whether or not Larian Studios just licensed this or did they co-fund it, co-finance it with Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. I just don't know. I haven't actually ever looked at that. I know that they've been pretty much given free reign to do what they wanted with this game, which suggests some form of autonomy. Maybe they went out and got their own investment money. But even if, let's just think for a moment, even if, Divinity Original Sin 1 or 2 were hugely successful, you don't go from 120 team members up to 400 team members across a period of 6 years without a massive, massive chunk of upfront change to help fund that. So that's something that's very important to understand because the distinction that some of these developers are making is that it's not fair for gamers to hold us up to the same standards when we're a 30-man team or a 40-man team and Larian has 400 people and essentially an unlimited bucket of funds to make the perfect game. That's why it's more of an anomaly as opposed to the new standard. So let's kind of there's some links down in here that people can look through, and I know some of them have dove into it a little bit more. But when they began work on this project, they had 7 different studios with over 400 developers and also used a 3-year early access period. And there's a Twitter thread that was started by Xavier Nelson Jr., co-founder of Strange Scaffold. And he did a Twitter thread and talking about how, like a lot of people, I'm deeply excited about what the lovely folks at Larian accomplished with Baldur's Gate 3, but I want to gently and preemptively push back against players taking that excitement and using it to apply criticism or a raised standards to RPGs moving forward. He went on to talk about how it's not a baseline for new RPGs, it's an anomaly. And while we should absolutely celebrate the achievement of Baldur's Gate 3, we should not consider this the new standard for all RPGs. And Grimlore Games senior narrative designer Rebecca Harwick spoke up in support of that and says, "You cannot be appalled by how much big money games cost to make, and at the same time, make those lavish productions the standard by which all games are judged. I hope Baldur's Gate 3 is a generous once-in-a-lifetime RPG, but I hope no one expects a 10, 20, or 40 person man team to make one." I think this is very interesting, especially when you look at what Tactical Adventures has done with Solasta. Because I will argue that Solasta, on a mechanics level, is very close to what Baldur's Gate 3 is. But on a much smaller scale, with a much smaller budget, with a much smaller team, with far less, cool graphics, far fewer spell effects. They don't have all of the animation cutscenes and the 17,000 hours of dialogue and all of these things that Baldur's Gate 3 is touting and purporting to have. That's the difference between like a 40-man team and a 400-man team. On the one hand, you're dealing with something that might have a, say conservatively $4 to $6 million budget, and then Baldur's Gate 3, which we don't know. I don't think the budget numbers have ever been talked about. I don't know if they ever will, but I would be shocked if this game cost less than $250 million to produce. I would be shocked. They built a mocap studio from scratch for this game. Like, they didn't have a cinematics division. Sven just talked about that in the Panel from Hell release one, that they took two guys and they built up this cinematic department that they had never had before to do all the cutscenes and everything. And that is a massive achievement in and of its own right, which, by the way, is going to permit and allow Larian Studios to build games like this in the future, whether it's an upcoming expansion to Baldur's Gate 3, or whether it's they turn around and do Divinity Original Sin 3. We don't know where they're going to go in the future, but their company is now poised to take advantage of all of the growth that they just went through because of the Baldur's Gate 3 development. And now I guarantee you, with the sales numbers that are coming in, that this is going to be a smash hit that's going to transform Larian Studios from this sort of indie darling that everyone has loved, and now put them into AAA space firmly. And I know some people have already sort of drawn comparisons to them and CD Projekt Red once upon a time, like when they first got started with the Witcher series. And I think that's a somewhat accurate comparison, but I think you could also look at early BioWare, with like Baldur's Gate 1 being the first game that they ever made that put them on the map, with Black Isle Studios and everything. So, I mean, there's just a lot of similarities you can look at as of this being sort of an RPG of the decade, perhaps, probably so. Game of the year, probably so. But the new standard for RPGs, I think that that's incredibly naive of anyone who enjoys RPGs, because what they're building here with a 400-man team, understand that this is Rockstar level of money. This is PlayStation. This is like God of War. This is like Red Dead Redemption 2 or the next Grand Theft Auto. They have put a ton of money and hundreds of people into this game over a 6-year period of time. This is a massive, 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 massive tentpole undertaking that is not something that a little 30-man team can pull off. I think as long as people are able to make that distinction, which I think is the concern that these developers are raising, because it says here that the article suggests that fans felt divided, some saying that consumers decide what the new standard should be, while others agree that the points about unusual development of Baldur's Gate 3, but have asserted that fans would want games of their favorite genre to get better and better. Well, everyone wants their favorite franchise to get better and better, but the reality is, just because What's up, everybody? Quick commercial break here to give it a shout out to our guild champions, who are the highest tier memberships here on YouTube: Ancient Entity, Assassin Gamer 94, Bubbleonia Rising, Crazy's Relative, Mujin, and Remedy. Thanks so much for the highest tier membership. And thanks to all of the members who support the channel, because you keep me doing this full time. You too can become a supporter if you're new here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an update. Join as a member. There's 3 different tiers. We do lots of special stuff: private polls, private videos. You get a shout out if you're the highest tier membership, but you can also do one-off donations in the form of super chats on any live stream or premiere you see, and of course super thanks on any upload or YouTube short. Whatever you can contribute, it's great. Keeps me on the air full time, keeps the cats fed, keeps the homestead running. Anyway, back to the video, everybody. you might want to buy it doesn't mean that 15 or 20 or 30 other million people want to buy it. And when a company is looking at producing a game of this caliber, there are budgets that have to be considered because they have to be, whether they're paying for it out of pocket or whether they're getting an investor on board or they have a publisher on board or they're getting a bank loan, whatever the case may be, putting their home up for collateral, there is a limited amount of money that a company can put into their project. And that amount of money depends on so many factors. So I think it is a good conversation to have about how maybe this is going to become the new gold standard for AAA RPGs. I think that would absolutely be a fair assessment. I think that we could look at this game and say, Baldur's Gate 3 is now the new standard for AAA companies. So Ubisoft, Santa Monica, Rockstar, like you need to look at this and say, well, our games, CD Projekt Red, our games need to be of equal quality to what Larian Studios is producing. And I would argue that those games are. Witcher 3 still stands out to be a lot of people. Yes, Cyberpunk 2077 had a poor launch, but it came back from that and has since established itself and re-earned that reputation that CD Projekt Red rightfully has as one of the best RPG developers on the market. And with the upcoming expansion coming out and more Witcher projects and everything else, like I think that the big companies, Assassin's Creed franchises, God of War franchise, and everybody is probably sitting up and taking note of this and going, okay, how much did it cost them? What did they do? Can we replicate? Can we make it better? Can we do it better? Can we double the budget? Can we, what is realistic for us to achieve? And then firmly separate the AAA companies out from the indie teams of 15, 20, 30 people. And as long as people can make the distinction, um, then we're good to go. The problem arises when you have gamers with unrealistic expectations or gamers who just don't understand the game development industry and they want all games to be as good as Baldur's Gate 3. Sure, we all want that, buddy, but unless you've got the unlimited budget to fund those games to be made at the same caliber of this with 400-man teams across 7 studios on an international scale, maybe take it down a notch and understand that this is definitely an anomaly and a generational sort of I would say that this is going to be a game that inspires many people for years to come, and I think that's a good place to start. So from my perspective, that's what I think about it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. If you have, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. Drop your comments down below. Hopefully we'll see you over the Discord and in the next live stream or video. Until then, everybody stay safe. Happy gaming.